Hello everyone, this is lesson 10 lecture with PowerPoint. It's going to cover several of the compromises that led down the road to having the Constitution we have now, and we'll go over the idea and significance terms, and then we'll get into each of the compromises. There's four main points in the chapter that you're going to want to know for idea and significance, and I'll go into more depth on each one of these after these two slides. The Virginia Plan, introduced to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, James Madison's Virginia Plan outlined a strong national government with three branches: the legislative, the executive, and judicial. The plan called for a legislature divided into two bodies, the Senate and the House of Representatives, with proportional representation. That is, each state's representation in Congress would be based on its population. The New Jersey Plan was an alternative to the Virginia Plan. William Patterson's New Jersey Plan intended to give states equal representation in a one-bodied legislature. Adopted on July 16, 1787, the Connecticut Compromise utilized both forms of representation, providing proportional representation in the House and equal representation in the Senate. The third one is the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise of 1787, also known as the Sherman Compromise, was an agreement reached during the Constitutional Convention between delegates of the states with large and small populations that defined the structure of the Congress and the number of representatives each state would have in Congress. According to the United States Constitution, under the agreement proposed by Connecticut Delegate Roger Sherman, Congress would be a bicameral or two-chambered body, with each state getting a number of representatives in the lower chamber, the House, proportional to its population, and two representatives in the upper chamber, the Senate. Number 4 is the Three-Fifths Compromise. This is straight from the early Constitution. Article 1, Section 2 of the United States Constitution states representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this Union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. They're really talking about all of the persons being slaves, and it's kind of difficult to kind of wrap your head around this, but you want to kind of think of it as they would take account of all the slaves, and then they would, whatever that number was, they would take 3/5 of that to count towards the representatives allotted to each slave state. So it wasn't really attached to the individual, but it was more of a way to meet the compromise between the states, because some wanted slaves to have full count, others wanted them to have none. So the Three-Fifths Compromise is what they came up with, and later it was basically eliminated by the other amendments. The third one is the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise of 1787, also known as the Sherman Compromise, was an agreement reached during the Constitutional Convention between delegates of the states with large and small populations that defined the structure of the Congress and the number of representatives each state would have in Congress. According to the United States Constitution, under the agreement proposed by Connecticut Delegate Roger Sherman, Congress would be a bicameral or two-chambered body, with each state getting a number of representatives in the lower chamber, the House, proportional to its population, and two representatives in the upper chamber, the Senate. Number 4 is the Three-Fifths Compromise. This is straight from the early Constitution. Article 1, Section 2 of the United States Constitution states representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this Union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. They're really talking about all other persons being slaves, and it's kind of difficult to kind of wrap your head around this, but you want to kind of think of it as they would take account of all the slaves, and then they would, whatever that number was, they would take 3/5 of that to count towards the representatives are allotted to each slave state. So it wasn't really attached to the individual, but it was more of a way to meet the compromise between the states, because some wanted slaves to have full count, others wanted them to have none. So the 3/5ths Compromise is what they came up with, and later it was basically eliminated by the other amendments. The New Jersey Plan was what was proposed to solve some of the issues with the arguments that were happening at the convention. William Patterson, later the New Jersey governor, he would become the governor later on, proposed keeping the Articles of Confederation, but make some changes. His changes included that there would be one house, they could tax, they could make laws and treaties, regulate trade. The executive branch would be made up of several people, and they would be appointed by the legislature. And then the executive branch would appoint Supreme Court justices. The New Jersey Plan failed to pass, which ended the idea of having only one house, a unicameral system. The New Jersey Plan addressed issues by giving Congress certain specific powers, and the plan added the ability to regulate trade between states. You might want to check your study guides now. You should be somewhere around question 1213. You can pause and go back if you missed something. So the ability to regulate trade between states, that was specific powers that were granted. Under this plan, Congress, one house would choose members of the executive branch, and the executive branch would select the court. Connecticut and Delaware were the main supporters of this plan. Just kind of recapping some of that there. After the New Jersey Plan failed, the convention went back to the Virginia Plan, and this ended the idea of a unicameral legislature. The states voted on equal representation in the upper house, which tied. It was a tied vote of 5-5, with Georgia divided. To solve this issue, they put together another committee composed of one delegate from each state. The committee came up with the Connecticut Compromise, now called the Great Compromise, and we'll get into that here in just a minute. Go ahead and stop there and check your study guides. You should be somewhere between questions 14 and 18. The third one is the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise of 1787, also known as the Sherman Compromise, was an agreement reached during the Constitutional Convention between delegates of the states with large and small populations that defined the structure of the Congress and the number of representatives each state would have in Congress. According to the United States Constitution, under the agreement proposed by Connecticut Delegate Roger Sherman, Congress would be a bicameral or two-chambered body, with each state getting a number of representatives in the lower chamber, the House, proportional to its population, and 2 representatives in the upper chamber, the Senate. Number 4 is the 3/5ths Compromise. This is straight from the early Constitution. Article 1, Section 2 of the United States Constitution states representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5ths of all other persons. They're really talking about all other persons being slaves, and it's kind of difficult to kind of wrap your head around this, but you want to kind of think of it as they would take account of all the slaves, and then they would, whatever that number was, they would take 3/5 of that to count towards the representatives or allotted to each slave state. So it wasn't really attached to the individual, but it was more of a way to meet the compromise between the states, because some wanted slaves to have full count, others wanted them to have none. So the 3/5ths Compromise is what they came up with, and later it was basically eliminated by the other amendments. All right, we're on to the 3/5ths Compromise. Before I get into the 3/5ths Compromise, which is going to probably hit upon a lot of your study guide questions, I want to make sure that you guys understand indentured servitude as a term and what it is, and it's actually quite interesting. So your textbook does not really go into any depth. It just says, the 3/5ths, with regard to the 3/5ths Compromise, they counted anyone that was an indentured servitude as regular vote, or racial slavery or black slavery was not. There's a little bit of a difference, but you need to understand what indentured servitude is. For that, I went over to Jay's store, which is your, where you find periodicals and articles on history, and they had a good article. It's the Journal of Economic History. That's where it's from, March 1984, and it's called The Rise and Fall of Indentured Servitude in the Americas and in colonial America. So this is kind of where I pulled a lot of this information from to kind of complement your book, where it doesn't go into a lot of detail. So they estimated that around half to 3/4 of all white men, immigrants, that came to the colonies did so under indenture. And I'll get to what the definition of indenture is here. Indenture servitude lasted until 1917 because it saw a resurgence in the 1840s with regard to what was going on in the West Indies. So indentured servitude was important because of a need for cheap labor. Settlers soon realized they had lots of land, but few workers. The Virginia Company bought settlers over, but it was expensive. To combat this, they created a system of servitude where, free white men wanting to immigrate to the United States would work 4 to 7 years in exchange for passage, room, board, and freedom dues. Life was hard, but it was not quite as bad as slavery, even though your textbook mentions this and kind of alludes to that, but it was quite bad, and there were a few different phases we'll get into. Let's see. Some argued that indentured servitude did well, those who entered it, because their freedom package sometimes included land, a year's worth of corn, arms, a cow, even got a cow, and new clothes. The punishments for those who ran off or broke the law were rather harsh, extremely harsh. For those who survived the voyage and harsh conditions in the New World, they had the opportunity to have or secure a modest life in the New World. In 1619, the first black slaves came to Virginia with no slave laws in place. They were initially treated as indentured servants and given the same opportunities. Slave laws were soon passed, though, first in Massachusetts and then Virginia, around 1641 to 1661. These laws ended all freedom for black or racial slaves. As demand for labor grew, so did the need for individual servants, but they became more expensive. The Virginia Company had to pay or offer more incentives to get people to come and work the land. And that began to compete. Once they got free, they began competing for that same land. The colonial elite started to shift at this point in time to black slaves, as they were more profitable and offered an endless supply of labor. As the system moved to racial slavery, indentured servitude drastically declined until slave laws in the West Indies brought back indentured servitude. Indentured servitude ended in 1917, but was in decline probably after the 1860s. And from 1860 to 1917, it was in decline again. In 1917, it was abolished. So in the article that I have on indentured servitude, it's quite interesting. When the Virginia Company first offered this to people, they had, let me see here, I gotta find that spot in this article. Maybe I'll just go off the top of my head. Okay, here we go. Okay, so they, the system had appeared in use by 1609. The arrangement under which large groups of men lived under and worked communally, it was kind of like quasi-military conditions. They proved to be very unpopular with people that were doing the indentured servitude. Conditions for the workers were hard. One observer commented in explaining the colony's high rate of mortality that the hard work and the scanty food on public works kills them and increases the discontent in which they live, seeing themselves treated like slaves with great cruelty. The response of some workers was to run away and live with the Indians. The company clearly felt that this action threatened the continued survival of their enterprise, for they reacted very forcefully to this crime. In 1612, the colony's governor dealt firmly with some recaptured laborers. Some he appointed to be hanged, some burned, some broke upon wheels, others to be staked, and some to be put in front of a firing squad. So very forceful response to that. The Virginia Company then, in 1916, came up with a new system, and new colonists bound for return to the company were sent over at the company's expense, and the free planters of the colony were allowed to rent them from the company for a year at a fixed rate. In addition to providing their maintenance, or probably their room and board and all that, the company believed that this system would yield them a number of advantages. The dispersal of the groups and new arrivals was expected to improve both their health and their industry. And so as indentured servitude was really the mechanism in which they were using to bring labor into the colonies before slavery took hold, it itself had gone through different phases. Because if if word gets back to Europe that it's really a bad gig, it's not worth it, half the people die, then who's going to do it? So the Virginia Company had to kind of change its approach to that. So it's important that you understand the premise of indentured servitude. And let me see if I can go over that definition for you. So basically, it's when you go to, you agree to do work for some number of years in exchange for paid passage to the colonies and room and board and all that. And a lot of those packages, like it said early on, would include things like land and food for a year and some, to get you set up in a modest life. So that's indentured servitude. Now, the ThreeFifths Compromise. So from the Constitution, this is written in Article 1, Section 2. 3/5 of a person's status, Article 1, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution states, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included with this union, according to the respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed. 3/5 of all other persons shall count. So when they looked at those that were people that were in slavery, like African Americans and whatnot, they took the number from the state as a whole. Let's say that's 100,000. They would take and give that state representation based on 3/5 of that number. And that's the compromise that they came up with. So the 3/5 Compromise was an agreement made in at the Constitutional Convention that allowed southern states to count a portion of its enslaved population for purposes of taxation and representation. The agreement allowed for the enslavement of black people to spread and played a role in the forced removal of indigenous peoples from their land later on. And the 13th and 14th Amendments effectively in the future will repeal the Three-Fifths Compromise. But looking at the Three-Fifths Compromise, it's going to give you what the book says on it, and here's where you're going to pick up your questions. Northern states argued that slave states would have an advantage. Its slaves were counted in representation. Slavery in the North was declining or abolished. They said it would allow the perpetuation of slavery as an institution. So they were not really for this idea. The South agreed that they should be counted as full persons, as they were the Southern equivalent to Northern farmers and laborers. They echoed John Locke even by saying an equal representation ought to be allowed for them in a government which was instituted principally for the protection of property and was itself to be supported by property. Not all Southerners agreed to this, though. Some did, many didn't. The Three-Fifths Compromise counted indentured servants and freemen as a whole person or a whole vote, collectively as in the state. Everyone else, i.e. slaves, counted as three-fifths, collectively as a state number, not really individually. This was also used for taxes. So that's how they created the state's tax base, what they had to pay the government. So this gave rise to the census, where every 10 years the government would count its citizens to see, more or less, how much representation would be granted to each state, because as populations change, people move, people come, people go, the representation of those states changes every 10 years. And we just had a census here, I think this past during COVID, or right after COVID. And that's what that does, is it gives you each state its representation. New states entering would have the same rights as others, but slavery was banned. Some responded like Virginia's George Mason and Prince Butler said slaves were economically valuable, but they could not regard them as equal to free men. Previously, Butler had compared slaves as the South's version of laborers and farmers. In your study guide, you should be around question 30, 31 right now, just in case you wanted to check. If you need to pause, go back, you can. But you should be around question 31. In the North, Butler had quoted Locke in saying slaves should be counted as full persons. The North argued that the reps elected in the South would serve the interests of slave owners and not slaves. So they weren't getting a voice themselves. Elbridge Gerry said it was inconsistent to slaves. It was inconsistent to refer to slaves as property when they say they're people, yet they want to count their vote. Basically, is what he's saying. So now Governor Morris had argued that the original 13 colonies should have control of the national government, including, I think, or no, they wanted to exclude the new states. So they wanted the 13 original colonies to have full control over the colonies. That was Governor Morris. Previously, though, the Northwest Ordinance mandated new states would have some rights as the original, so they really couldn't do that. In order to measure population and adjust representation, the U.S. began the census every 10 years, and that's like it's every 10 years, a decade. So that should get you pretty well to the end of your study guide, and I will post the article that I included on indentured servitude up on the social studies site and Google Classroom. And at this point, you can make sure your study guides are finished, and you're going to want to study those study guides. I'll try to get a GIMP kit up for this to help study, and then you'll take the test in the social studies site or formative, one of the two here this week.